All right, guys, I know it's been a little while. I feel like I say this at the beginning of every one of these videos, that it's been a while.
We actually do want to do these more frequently, and I feel like I say that every time.
Yeah, I think eventually we'll get there. We'll definitely get there. It's just there's always so much going on, you know. But in any case, this is another adaptation fixation, but this one is a little different than how we've previously done these. Instead of just reviewing, or not even reviewing, we really just kind of break down a movie, we're breaking down and kind of comparing two movies because we thought that would be a fun thing to do. I'm Spazzy, and as always, with me for this series is Wolfman. Wolfman, do you want to tell everybody what it is that we're breaking down?
Okay, we are pretty excited because we are comparing Resident Evil, the movie from 2002, to Resident Evil Welcome to Raccoon City, the movie from October of 2021, so 3 months for us, hopefully not too long for when this comes out.
Yeah, it's almost 20 years, and what a difference that may or may not have made for the quality of this movie.
Yeah.
I'd be curious, maybe you know, as far as relative budget of these movies, because neither one of them seemed like a particularly high budget movie.
Okay, I'm looking right now, thanks to the internet's most reliable resource, Wikipedia. Obviously an asterisk there as a library, and I can't do this without the asterisk. Kind of famously, Resident Evil was only on a budget of $33 million. Welcome to Raccoon City was on a budget of $25 million, which is pretty shocking, to be honest, because I really did expect, because it feels much more impressive.
Yeah, I'll say that. It's kind of difficult, I think, going back and looking at movies from that time, because what Matrix were we up to at that point?
We were, I believe, up to Reloaded. And I mean, if you're going to be, like, comparing a Paul W.S. Anderson movie to a Lana and Lily Wachowski movie,
I think there's I mean, yes, but this movie very much had an influence. It tried to be slick like The Matrix, I guess is what I'm saying.
100%. This was, like...
especially with some of the action scenes.
So, yeah, actually, I think this might be good to kind of go into the making of the first movie, because I think that's a useful thing for, like, actually exploring what makes these movies different.
Sure.
So initially what happened is that, Resident Evil came out in 1996. This was the year of Mario 64, Crash Bandicoot, Tomb Raider, Pokemon, and it was a big year for video games, and Resident Evil was, to do a pun, it took one of the biggest bites. You know what? No, I'm standing by that pun.
I appreciate the pun. Don't worry about it.
But it was this, like, very odd thing, because on one hand, it was a zombie movie, or a zombie video game. Perhaps I Freudian slip there, because it was a zombie game, a horror game, which really wasn't a big and significant part of the, like, gaming, of the mainstream gaming culture. But it was also a Japanese company doing what was essentially an American cop movie. Like, Resident Evil was basically an attempt by a Japanese studio, Capcom, to interpret American zombie movies and science fiction movies and cop movies into this bizarre and very goofy story where you heal using magical herbs, and everyone has this bizarre cadence, and the acting's weird, and it turns out that there's this crazy mansion that's secretly a laboratory and has a shark in it.
I brought this up recently. It must have been on maybe a Good Morning Source Gaming or a podcast I was on. I don't recall exactly. But adapting video games, especially early video games, is kind of a weird process, because so many of those video games were clearly just so heavily inspired by actual movies of the day. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Double Dragon.
Yeah.
Street Fighter.
Even Metroid is very alien. They just take a concept from a movie and then they turn that into a game. So you're kind of reverse engineering it back into a movie while trying to keep what makes a video game unique. But those are weird video game elements that don't necessarily translate well to film, you know?
Yeah. As a side note, Metroid also, soundtrack came from Birdie, the weird Nicolas Cage movie that no one remembers.
Really? I was unaware of that. Learn something every time we do one of these.
Resident Evil 96 became a phenomenal success, and it spawned multiple sequels. At the time that the first movie was being made, it spawned already, I think, 3. Resident Evil 2, 3 Nemesis, and then Code Veronica, which I want to say Code Veronica was being made recently enough that it didn't impact the actual movie's production. Not to mention multiple spin-offs and comics and a book series by S.T. Perry that, maybe we will actually cover, because I kind of want to do book novelizations of video games for the series at some point.
I wouldn't mind.
With the success that it had, Capcom was very interested in actually, making something out of this. There were a lot of, there's a lot of commercial potential, and one of the people that they really wanted to get to this project was a guy named George Romero,
obviously,
who you might be familiar with. It was Romero's Night of the Living Dead and Dawn of the Dead movies that really inspired Resident Evil Zombies, certainly. And he actually directed a commercial for RE2. And although it specifically a commercial that was only shown in Japan, which is crazy to me.
That does seem weird.
It was big enough that Sony, who actually got, I guess, the rights to this, brought Romero on. They specifically offered him and asked him to do a treatment for a Resident Evil movie that he would direct. And he did. He wrote a script for Resident Evil that was apparently not just weirdly that was apparently faithful to the game. It also was faithful to the sequels to the game, featuring the leads from the first game, Chris and Jill, along with Barry, Rebecca, even characters like Wesker and Ada Wong. Or I guess Wesker would have had to be because he was in the he was the villain of the first game. But apparently Romero actually wrote multiple drafts for this, but each one actually got rejected because one claim was that at least one of his were too violent. They wanted something that was a lot more marketable,
and palatable to a general audience. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. And to be fair, if we're being honest, Resident Evil, I think you could argue, does have that. Even the most recent entries, 7 and Village, they're gruesome, but they're also very funny and zany in their own way. Yeah.
It's not. The horror is never so realistic that it makes it difficult to stomach.
Yeah, it goes to that whole cop movie thing. You're not going to actually see realistic portrayals of a person being horribly mutated or police violence. You're always going to see something that's more lighthearted and more approachable.
Yeah. By the way, I just as an aside, just thinking about this, because people always talk about how Nintendo got scared off from making feature films based off of their properties because of the Mario Brothers movie. I love that Capcom said, screw it, whatever. We did Street Fighter the movie, but we're right back in there. It's not even that many years later.
Apparently, they still make money off that Street Fighter movie.
I don't know. Do they get paid every time somebody uses a GIF of Bison? Because
no, they have some of the rights to the actual film, so whenever it gets shown on cable.
Yeah, it's weird. I feel like you never see the Mario Brothers movie on.
That's.
Now that we're talking about it. But I feel like people would watch it, as much as they watch Street Fighter.
There's, I'm just going to say, there is a reason why Riff Tracks was able to release VODs of the Mario movie and the Double Dragon movie, and they only released audio commentary for Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat. Because the rights to Super Mario Bros. 93 is literally so cheap that they got it for a song.
Well, speaking of Mortal Kombat, the movie, I think we're going to have a bridging statement pretty soon.
Before we do, I just want to make one last aside, because this is going to be something I'm going to probably be going back to a few times. This is shameless self-promotion, but, whatever. Last year, when for Resident Evil Village, I wrote an article about Resident Evil Village, but also about a lot of the tropes of Resident Evil, about how it kind of functions as a specifically sci-fi cinematic kind of horror.
Yeah.
because I think that's really important for kind of getting into what makes these movies different, because I think that they go about interpreting that in very different ways. But that'll be for then. For now, what happened is that with the Romero script basically thrown out, and there was other scripts too that were rejected, but what happened is that in 95, before Resident Evil even came out, a young guy named Paul W.S. Anderson got a lot of success for basically making a low-budget movie based on Mortal Kombat that became one of the biggest blockbusters of the year. So, around this point, Anderson was not thinking about doing a Resident Evil movie. He did, however, play Resident Evil in I assume when it came out in 96, and wrote a script that was essentially, which he himself described as a ripoff of Resident Evil called Undead. Apparently, Constantin Film, the German production company that bought the film rights for Resident Evil, liked his ripoff script so much that they simply said, you know what, turn it into an official Resident Evil movie.
That explains so much about this movie.
Yes. Then he cast Michelle Rodriguez, Mila Jovovich, his wife, and David Boreanaz until Boreanaz dropped down.
Were they already married at the time? Mila Jovovich?
I actually don't know, and I do apologize for that.
They married in 2009, so no, I guess they met on the probably
on the set.
On the set, it was love at first bite.
Yeah. well, that's actually kind of funny, and I don't really want to mention this now because I kind of want to focus on this, talk about this more later, if that's okay.
Sure.
But this movie and every other, Anderson only directed, I think, like 3 or 4 of his 6-movie series. He produced all of them, though. Mila starred in all of them. But they really feel like this kind of big romantic missive from Anderson to Jovovich, to the point where it's genuinely surprising to me that they weren't married by this point. Like, she and her character are just so aggressively, lovingly portrayed. And objectified, not just in, like, a sexual way, but also as, like, a just like, portrayed as this incredibly indomitable action hero.
Yeah, and, like, it's interesting. Are there any versions of those Romero scripts that exist anywhere? Because I would love to read one of them.
I genuinely did not look. I do apologize for that. I would be really interested, too. So,
That's how this movie came to be.
Yeah. By contrast,
it makes sense that it was originally not Resident Evil, because it doesn't really have that much to do with Resident Evil. But at the same time, it does seem like a Resident Evil ripoff if it wasn't Resident Evil. It's got that,
by contrast, Resident Evil Welcome to Raccoon City had like a drastically different effect. What happened is that it was pre-production started in 2017 when Resident Evil: The Final Chapter had already come out. That's the 6th movie in Anderson's 6-movie series, which is also, I should note, probably the second worst of the 6-movie series. The movies were still immensely successful. Like, every one of most of these movies went over the $100 million mark for audiences, despite all of them being really under, like, 30 million. These were very cheap, tight action movies for the most part. But, the Final Chapter, I think, was viewed as underperforming, or at least performing worse than the other movies, and between that and a general recognition that what the movies had become may have been fun. I think of them as mostly fun, but it wasn't really quote-unquote Resident Evil, and it was time to reboot, because that's what everyone does these days.
Yep.
So what happened is a guy named Johannes Roberts was attached to write and direct this film to replace James Wan, or who was initially producing it, and then I guess instead went to producing Mortal Kombat. You can decide for yourself which was the best move.
which Paul W.S. Anderson reboot was the better product.
Yeah, but I mean, the thing is ultimately that Wan still wins, because that guy got to have the best thing. Oh, because you know what? That guy directed Malignant.
Yeah. He won. Not only that, but Mortal Kombat did well enough to get a sequel, and, he's got that Aquaman money, so, I mean, overall, the dude's just winning.
Yeah, Yeah, Wan, the guy who directed the second best DCEU movie, and Malignant is doing pretty, and good for him because I fucking love Malignant so much. Anyway, the point is that of all this is not to extol the praises of 2021's best Neo Giallo movie. It's to really focus on the fact that, we now had a new person in charge of this project, and Roberts was basically... I should note, Roberts is a self-professed fan of that original Resident Evil movie, but he was, like a lot of the fans, kind of very excited to go back to what he, a quote, like, back to basics, more faithful adaptation, one that was... made, I don't want to say made by Resident Evil fans for Resident Evil fans, although I kind of think that is the movie he wound up with.
It's so weird, and I mean, we'll get into it in a little bit more detail when we like really dive into the movie, but it has so much like iconography from the Resident Evil games, and it has so much superficial fan service. She eats a Jill sandwich, but it still kind of misses everything that I think actual fans of the game would want. It's so weird.
And I think maybe if that's okay, if we now will transition from that into the basic plots of these, because I think this is where we really see this. Resident Evil 2002 is... No, you know what? So normally when I do this, when I jump into these, I wrote a lot of notes. I did not for this movie, partially because I saw Welcome to Raccoon City twice in the past 3 or so weeks. That once casually and then once a couple days ago for this podcast, and partially because Resident Evil 2002 I've seen multiple times already, although I did rewatch it for this, but partially because of the fact that the plot to Resident Evil 2002 is very light. There is a breakout of zombies at a lab underneath a mansion. There is a woman who is amnesiac and who is a scientist who may also be a secret agent who is then captured and then tasked with deactivating the AI program inside the lab to stop the zombie virus.
The Red Queen and the Hive and other things that are not in Resident Evil. There's not a single character in that movie that is in a Resident Evil game. Not one.
The evil doctor, who's also the narrator, played by Jason Isaacs. This would be 3 years before he got eaten by the crazy water monster in Avatar. Says, now get ready for prepare the Nemesis project.
Yeah. And actually, I think it's kind of interesting that it's so loosely connected to Resident Evil. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think at the end of the movie they say, let's move her to the Raccoon City facility, right?
It's setting up the...
Yeah, exactly. But what I'm saying is, which leads you to believe that she's not in Raccoon City and this is a different Umbrella facility.
Yeah.
So, in a weird way, and they completely ruined this with the second Resident Evil movie from that series, but the first movie can kind of be taken as a weird prequel or sidequel to the games. Because,
Rosencrantz and Guildenstern if Shakespeare forgot to include Rosencrantz and Guildenstern.
Yeah, because we don't know who Nemesis was, so this would basically be the origin of Nemesis and how a character that we never heard of in the games ended up in Raccoon City. But then, once they did the second Resident Evil movie, I don't remember what it's called, then they started introducing, half-ass introducing Jill and other characters and stuff.
Jill is there. I want to say Carlos is there.
Carlos is definitely there.
A lot of very unpleasant stereotypes are there, and Nemesis is there.
Yeah, so, and he does say stars, so I mean, what do you want? Yeah. But we're not talking about the movie, we're talking about the first one. And in the first one, I like how in the later movies, Mila Jovovich's Alice is a character. A lot of rabbit imagery because she's Alice. Is it superhuman the way that they turn her towards the end of those other films?
Later on, because the thing with this whole Resident Evil movie series, and we don't really see this as much in this one, but over time, they become less of adaptations of Resident Evil and more of essentially a movie about video games with a Resident Evil mold. So Alice gets superpowers, she gets abilities, she then loses her abilities, and she loses lives and goes back down to from Super Alice to Small Alice.
Yeah, it's weird, but it's not very Resident Evil, but
No.
Yeah.
But in general, all of this is basically tied around a nothing of a plot, to the point where this really doesn't even feel like a plot. It feels like a music video that inexplicably got to feature length.
Yeah, and it's interesting because the first movie has very little to do with Resident Evil, but you can kind of retrofit it into the world of Resident Evil. It's disconnected in a way that works, because you're all like, yeah, I don't know any of these characters, but this isn't that story. This is another story set within the world of Resident Evil. And then the next few films after that one try to shoehorn in existing Resident Evil plots and characters, and it doesn't work. And it just gets weird and has nothing to do with anything.
Well, that's the thing, is like, that's true. At the time, however, I think there is something interesting in the fact that, like, I'm sure Capcom was happy that this existed, in the same way that I'm sure they're happy that they get, money from Street Fighter every time it's played on cable. But
companies love money.
But in a way, it does actually feel like it gets an ethos of Resident Evil as a pop culture thing, rather than Resident Evil's like actual goals and themes and beliefs. And this is, I think, in direct contrast to Resident Evil Welcome to Raccoon City, which essentially trades away no plot for trying to tell 2 video games worth of plot into one story.
Yeah, it's weird. Like, first of all, I think some of the characters that one thing I do kind of appreciate about Welcome to Raccoon City is they don't waste any characters on characters that are not from the game. They're all like, I don't care who it is, we're just going to throw them in there. There's
it's very economical.
Yeah, economical, very much so. They don't, even though it's kind of bloated with plotting characters, I feel like there's no wasted space for like extra characters.
Yeah. This movie is under 2 hours, and to be honest, one of my criticisms is that I genuinely think it could have been stretched a little bit, because, to give more in the way of story and character motivations and things.
Yeah, no, for sure. I don't know, like, it's so weird to me, and some of the casting choices are weird. I think Wesker is just like
the worst.
An awful miscast. Yeah, like I don't know what they were trying to do with that character.
I feel like we will, like, when we go into more of the stuff at the end, that can maybe hit it, but like, basically of them, I think Claire and Leon and Jill were the strongest. Chris was kind of a mediocre midline. Wesker was the weakest, and Irons was not that bad, but I mean,
his acting was super over the top and bad, dude.
What are you expecting from Donal Logue, who... No, sorry. The reason I ask this, and the reason I am being so... Oh, Jesus Christ. I knew it. I'm sorry for waiting everyone for a few seconds, but I fucking knew it. That Donal Logue starred in this movie as Police Chief Irons a year after doing Dummy, the semi-autobiographical Dan Harmon show, in which he plays Dan Harmon in a show effectively litigating his and his wife's relationship with Dan Harmon's sex toy fetish, or sex doll fetish.
I mean, he's fine for what he is, I guess, but like, it's so hammy and it doesn't match the tone of the other actors. A lot of the acting is like, I say this, I don't want to get any hate for this, but it's very CW, like the level of acting in this movie overall. This is definitely, and that's not always a bad thing, that doesn't have to be a bad thing. I wouldn't mind if, the characters of, say, I don't know, Legends of Tomorrow showed up in Raccoon City for no reason. Yeah, I almost feel like this would have worked better as a TV series.
TV show.
Yeah.
Yeah. It absolutely would have worked better as a TV series. And the thing is, when I ever think about this, I kind of have to deal with the fact that essentially this movie is unbelievably ambitious, and that it's trying to tell 2 different stories together in a way that, I think conceptually could make them pretty interesting, but it's so stuffed with stuff.
Yeah, and it's weird too. I mentioned this last time we spoke, that I don't have any issue with this at all because I feel like they fit the characters well, but they played loose and race swapped Leon and Jill, just to have
which is cool.
Yeah, which is fine to have a little bit more diversity in there. I'm fine with that. But at the same time, they got rid of like the one person of color that actually lives in Raccoon City, Lieutenant Barnar.
Yeah, Marvin.
Yeah,
and
Marvin.
Then, Carlos.
And Carlos.
Which,
yeah, but I know you don't. But see, I think Carlos is a fine character. I feel like you don't like Carlos because of the old movies.
my feeling is ultimately that, like, Marvin and Carlos, for what they are, really aren't that important as people, as characters within this world. And it's, like, if you want to include diversity, it's probably ultimately more important to include those with main characters, especially knowing what the director wants to do with Leon.
Which we'll talk about in a second. But as far as missed characters, too, I don't want this to get... This didn't need to be more overstuffed than it already is and everything, but I really felt the loss of Rebecca and Barry. Like...
Yeah.
Especially Barry. Barry's such a great character.
So we talked about this, or we said that this was about the plot. I do want to mention the plot.
Sure, go for it.
Yeah, which is that, like I said, this is actually, the secret is that this is not an adaptation of Resident Evil from 1996. It's an adaptation of Resident Evil and Resident Evil 2, which, one thing that this film is kind of interesting, another way that this film is interesting is that, compared to the original movie, is that the first movie was very much like the, like next Sunday, the not too distant future, right? Like,
yeah.
Everything is, which, to be fair, I think you would probably assume if you played those Resident Evil games, because those were kind of not really super duper distinctly set, like, other than, basically late 90s. But one of the interesting things about Resident Evil is that as it's gone on, it's treated those dates hard and fast, unlike, say, the superhero comics industry.
Right, or even like a game like Street Fighter, where it's all like, I don't know, at some point stuff happened.
Yeah, it's all like set in this vague, it's modern time, but no, it's really the 80s, but it's like, yeah, Resident Evil is very much set within that universe. Chris investigates the house in 1998, because Resident Evil 2 came out in 1998, and they need Resident Evil to only happen a few months before Resident Evil 2, but then Chris also shoots Ethan's wife in Resident Evil Village, which is set in and was released in 2021. Like Chris is in his 50s by the time of the current games. This film actually did decide to focus on that, which is something I find really cool. Although it goes a little bit ham-fisted at times when literally there are so many references specifically to contemporary culture and technology. Like, at one point, I think a person says that he's going to go blockbuster and chill. There's a part where Chris makes fun of Claire because he's confused at what a message board is. There's the part where Chief Irons talks about how, great Steve Perry's music is, and I can't say I agree with you fully there. And then which kind of reaches the greatest part, which is that he's shot down, like he's attacked and shot up by hunks, set to Any Way You Want It by Journey.
Oh, it is. This movie is so... I don't know, man. Like I said, it's definitely not a good movie, and it doesn't even... I have fun with it, though. I will admit that. It is definitely a movie that I think if you are a fan of Resident Evil, in particular, you should watch it, because there's so many references. There are so many references.
Yeah. There's a lot, to the point where, like, I'm gonna say... I watched this, the first time I watched it online with some friends. Two of the people there were people who, did not know Resident Evil at all, or one of them didn't know Resident Evil at all. One of them only knows, like, Resident Evil 4 and 7 and Village, because they've seen me play those games. And neither of them really understood the full plot. I think a lot of it is that it's very referential, and maybe that kind of got away of Roberts a little bit. But yeah, the actual full plot is essentially that there are two stories that eventually do converge. One is that's all about mostly a group of cops in Raccoon City, which in the original games was sort of like just a small town, and as the Resident Evil game scope got bigger, it instead went from being like a small town to a mid-sized city to just a straight-up metropolis. Welcome to Raccoon City probably takes the smartest tactic. This is a dying town because of the fact that it was tied to the evil pharmaceutical company Umbrella, who's moving out and either deliberately released a zombie virus or simply, casually didn't care that it happened because they were moving to a new location. And so our first group of characters is Chris Redfield, the hyper-jacked, super, tough, giant,
he punches
of a man.
He punches rocks, I think Robbie Amell actually fit the look, if nothing else, of Chris, and Chris is never really that dynamic or interesting of a character, if we're being honest, so I felt like his Chris was fine.
There's a reason why Shinji Mikami, the original creator of Resident Evil, his favorite is Jill, of the two of them, and he's right.
Yeah, I'm going to say, we were talking about economical storytelling. The Raccoon City Orphanage is such an iconic part of Resident Evil 2, and by tying Chris and Claire into that orphanage, which is not something I remember from the games in any way.
It's not at all. It gives them a sort of a narrative hook, and an extra. There's an extra element of character importance too, because they're basically their lives have been kind of shaped by this town
and by Umbrella and by Birkin. I thought that was actually a pretty smart.
It was, yes.
Storytelling choice.
It's weird, and when I was in that room with mostly Resident Evil nerds, we were all like, "Wait, what the hell?" But I do think it's ultimately a smarter move. So plot A is Chris Redfield. What 30 Rock, I believe, once described John Hamm as looking like a cartoon pilot. Jill Valentine, his best friend, who maybe they each have the hots for each other, ? And giant football man Albert Wesker, who in the video games was their captain, who is also a traitor, and then also a scientist, and then also Agent Smith from The Matrix, and then a guy who tried to commit genocide on anyone who was not immune to the poisonous effects of a flower before Chris blew him up with a rocket launcher in a volcano. In this, he is simply just the hatchet man for Umbrella, which I think is probably the smartest way to play it.
I don't mind that as his role. But I dislike how he didn't seem to, because I feel like Wesker to be effective has to be more of a big picture guy, and he wasn't. He was just so much of a lackey that he didn't even know what he was doing. I mean,
keep in mind though that in the first game, there's not really even a big indication that Wesker is even a scientist. That stuff did come later, and as did the trench coat and the superpowers.
Yeah, I get that, but it's you look at this dude, and
he's not that interesting.
They cast him, I guess, because he was in the Umbrella Academy, and they're all Umbrella Academy, Umbrella Corporation, which I assume is the same reason Mark Webb directed a Spider-Man movie, because his name was Webb. I don't he would have actually been a better Chris, to be honest with you, because that fits more in the mold. Yeah. Because even if you are talking about the first game and how Wesker didn't kind of fill that role in the first game,
you're making these. He is now.
Yeah, exactly. You're making these movies with an eye to make further movies, which I don't know if that'll happen now. But so you have to cast Wesker to be able to do both. Yeah,
you can't really, especially since you're doing Resident Evil 2, and this is also heavily inspired by the Resident Evil 2 remake that came out in 2019, to the point where in the B plot they make sure that there's a dramatic moment where Leon gets his famous bulletproof armor and Claire unzips her red jacket. And it's
they literally have they redo the stupid burger scene. It's so amazing.
So the B plot involves the young rookie complete screw-up cop Leon Kennedy, who is basically the butt of every joke and everyone hates him, and he's
by the way, talking about I'm sorry, but talking about video game stuff, just because and I guess if we do more breakdown in the plot, maybe this would have been more appropriate when we got here. But I like when they're like, Jill, can you shoot this ketchup bottle off of Leon's head? Because that reminds me so much of the stupid bonus statues in the Resident Evil games.
That's like, and then she just decides to say screw it and throws the water bottle.
Yeah, that diner scene might be my favorite scene in the entire movie, to be honest with you. And that's like in the first 10 minutes of the movie.
Even the part where Jill grabs the sandwich and says, "Oh, it's Jill's sandwich now," which I believe when I saw that for the first time, I was like, I'm genuinely not sure whether to applaud or groan. And I'm still not.
They managed to put in as many references as they can in places you don't expect. I apologize for cutting you off. Go through it. I won't do it again.
No problem. That's no problem. Look, we cut each other off a lot. It can often
it's what we do.
I think that there are times where it's like a drama. So we've got our B plot, which is, to be honest, more interesting than the A plot. I think one of the big problems of this movie is the fact that a lot of the best stuff in the movie is specifically the plot of Claire, who is a runaway, renegade drifter who's now coming back to town to look for her twin brother, Chris. Leon, who's the dumb guy who basically doesn't know anything and everyone hates him, and then he eventually finds his, inner hero. And the chief, the town's police chief, Irons, who in the video games was a serial killer pedophile. And in this one is thankfully rewritten to just be an asshole.
Yes, he is. But once again, I'm glad they decided to use that character, because why not? You need somebody that leads, in head of the police department. So just reuse him, make him slightly less repugnant,
I mean, I kind of wish he was a little more sleazy, because ultimately, I think that having, the highest guy in the police force of this, this was a company town. I feel like there is perhaps stuff to mine about the fact that guy should be corrupt. And I think that that's not doing that is kind of a weird missed opportunity narratively. But I guess they didn't want to have more than one of the main team be a traitor. Yeah, so they're in the police station because basically there's almost nothing left. There are people in town, but the main company's gone. It's considered a dead town. And this is something we learn not in the first cold open, not in the second cold open, because there are 2 cold opens in this movie, but the text crawl after the second cold open, which explains it. And I gotta be honest, I really am not a fan of a lot of text crawls. And I'm not a fan of it in either of the movies, because both of these movies employ it.
Yeah, and what the weird thing is? I feel like there was a perfect time to talk about that, and they kind of touch upon it when she's talking to Chris, a scene later.
Yeah, and they talk about it in the diner. They talk about it in the second cold open, where Claire is with the predatory trucker, who then runs over a woman, and guess what? The woman he ran over is a zombie.
I think that they did a good job of making me feel bad for that dog that was going to become a zombie.
Yeah. Yeah, basically, you have our 2 plots of, the cops who are trying to hold the home front and the ones who are trying to investigate the ancient Spencer Mansion, which, as it turns out, is a laboratory for zombies, as is the orphanage that is conveniently very close to the police station, where Claire meets her childhood friend, a mutated woman named Lisa Trevor, who lived in the walls of the orphanage and later helps them fight the zombies. And what I really liked, I think you didn't like it so much.
I think it was very, very... I mean, it was good use of Lisa Trevor. That is a character I did not think I would see in any Resident Evil movie ever.
Yeah, for people unfamiliar, Lisa, in the remake, the 2001 remake of Resident Evil 1, which is, a very, very good game by all accounts. It's a little too scary for me to play, despite the fact that I, play a bunch of the other ones. Anyway.
Well, it's because the older one, especially that one, it's the combination of the tank controls and the scarcity of resources and the Crimson Heads. Yeah, it makes it a much more
intimidating.
Yeah. I really like that. Might be my favorite Resident Evil, though. I really like Remake.
For me, it's somewhere. It's 4, and then after 4, it's Village. actually.
I never played Village, but I watched my wife play through most of it, and it seems like it's because I think 7 kind of I wasn't a huge fan of it, and Village seemed like it. Village is such an upgrade, man.
Village is cool because Village is basically it's what if 7 was also Resident Evil 4?
Very much.
Like, it's both games, basically.
Yep.
But, like, to the point where it feels like a better remake of 4 than the actual remake of Resident Evil 4 probably will be.
Yeah, I feel like that. I wonder if part of the reason they're redoing Resident Evil 4 is not just because it's a popular one, but because you probably have a lot of assets from Village that they can reuse.
No, those are apparently being done by different teams. I think this team may have been brought from the remake team to do Village instead. Maybe?
I don't know, but let's get back to the movie. But yeah, so she was... go ahead and explain who Lisa Trevor is in the remake.
Yeah. Basically, to flesh out, not pun, actually really not intended, the world of the Spencer Mansion Resident Evil 1, they added a bunch of other characters and parts, and one of the more disturbing is Lisa Trevor, who is the daughter of the man who basically built the mansion, and they kind of kidnapped, and then the Umbrella kidnapped him and then tortured all the family members, and she's the only survivor, and so she crawls around with her hands bound in these giant stocks, and she wears all the faces of her tormentors, and in the game she's a boss and is very scary, and it's kind of sad because of the fact that she's one of the biggest victims of the entire franchise. So killing her and having her be a boss, there's something kind of sad about it. In the movie, she instead gets to be a hero, an 11th hour hero who saves Claire and Leon from the liquor.
Which one of the only things that ties these two movies together.
Yeah.
Is the liquor.
The liquor in the games is it's a zombie person that also acts like a wall-crawling lizard with a giant tongue and exposed brain. And I forget if they're blind, but have an acute sense of smell.
They can hear you pretty well, I know that. It doesn't really matter, though. They're just weird wall-climbing things with tongues. And they are in both the...
movies.
Yeah, in both of these movies.
In the first movie, it's the final boss, basically.
It is, and it's a little weird. Because we didn't really go over the plot of the first one. I know it's pretty straightforward, but there are some elements to it where they're trying to take Raccoon City down, Umbrella down, and also she was a defector, but she was a guard, and she had a fake husband. It's funny because there's a lot of little details, but there's still, like you said, no real plot. There's not much to it.
It's the ending is essentially this is literally any zombie movie with a military theme, which is a bunch of tough guys and a couple gals, one of whom is played by Michelle Rodriguez in what really feels like an homage to Vasquez from Aliens.
Very much so.
Basically kind of perfected this role. Who are all basically coming into town to storm out the zombies, and one by one they all get cut down, and one of them gets bit, and then he hides the illness from everyone, and they have to shoot him, and then one person hides her illness, and she has to fight to the end, and eventually everything blows up, and they escape on a train car, and then Alice, our lead, gets basically kind of abducted by scientists to be purged of all the virus that may have contaminated her. It's, like I said, it's a weird thing because basically watching it, there's no real characters. There's no real character arcs. That's why I described it as a music video. It's very odd to kind of actually ascribe strict material to it. So
my apologies for having a refresher on that movie in the middle of the plot synopsis for this movie.
No problem. Ultimately, I think it's kind of good to to be honest, I think it's less interesting to have here's one than the other. I think it's good to have these kind of combined. But yeah, in the new one, eventually they all meet up at the mansion where Wesker betrays them, and it turns out all this time there is a character called William Birkin, who in the video games was one of the main zombie scientists, who then gets betrayed, and he's so angered by his betrayal that he basically mutates himself into a super monster.
Very close to the games, really, to be honest.
Yes. Actually, exceedingly close.
Played by the same actor who played M. Bison in The Legend of Chun-Li.
Look, Neil McDonough is apparently very good at playing Capcom villains in the same way that Hirohiro Tagawa is really good. Tagawa is really good at playing fighting game villains.
Yeah, like no, but I mean that's like a pretty cool thing to say that I in arguably two of the biggest, definitely the top 4 or 5 Capcom franchises, I played the main villain in movies that. Maybe not were the best movies. Although I will watch this movie 12 times before I watch The Legend of Chun-Li again, which we will have to do.
I am gonna go away from your position and say that I ultimately like Welcome to Raccoon City, but Legend of Chun-Li is
bad. We're gonna talk about it one day.
It is bad to a degree that goes beyond the normal scales of bad. It is the Simpsons line of how it went from everyday villainy into full-on cartoonish supervillainy.
Yeah, it is like... I will compare it to the Last Airbender movie in quality. Like, it's that tier.
More offensive, but yes.
Yes, it is in that tier, I guess is what I'm saying. This, like, I don't know, like I said, I think this movie was fun. Ultimately, I enjoyed it, but we'll get there. So, sorry. Keep going.
Yeah. And, eventually so they kill Birkin but save Birkin's daughter, Sherry, just straight from the game, from RE2 and RE2 make. And our 5 survivors come out, and it's done. Except for the post-credits scene where Wesker, who died, comes out of a body bag and realizes he's blind and has to be given sunglasses so that he can see. And he's given to them by Ada Wong, who is, in the video games, she's Leon's Catwoman, but if Leon was G.I. Joe and Catwoman was Fujiko Mine from Lupin the Third. And I guess she's gonna be the Nick Fury of this cinematic universe that may or may not happen, and I hope happens because I really like this movie.
I do want to say that I appreciate that both this movie and the original Resident Evil theatrical movie took the Resident Evil 2 ending and just redid it. Like, that was the end. Yeah. Like, the train, and this one actually was Birkin, but the other one, it was just a mutated hunter. One thing I appreciate a lot about this one is that it took so many dumb cues from the games, and one of the things was, oh no, we better shoot Birkin in the eyes that are growing out of him. If we gotta shoot all of the eyes.
Look, as any good Japanese video game character knows, you go for the eyes. That's what Link does. And you know what? It works for Link every time.
I think both movies had undead crows, or am I just thinking of No, I'm thinking of the undead crows in the later Resident Evil movies from the original series.
Yeah.
I think so. Well, but they both had dogs. They did both have dogs.
They did, and Ari and Resident Evil 2002 had a dog getting kicked in the face, which is very similar to, of course, Keanu Reeves' dog assault in Point Break.
Yeah, but then she, to give it even more Keanu flavor, she did like a Matrix kick to his face.
Yes. A lot of fans of Resident Evil who resent Anderson's movies, they do so, like, part of it is that they don't like Alice. A common complaint is that she's too powerful, or that she's like, the new character who supersedes all the old characters. And I think the latter part is, fair. Like, if you see a movie based on a property, it's fair to assume that the main characters will be the main character, that will be characters from that property. But Alice is very fun and kind of perfect for the tone those movies set, and the tone this movie sets, where it's like, it's a music video, and she is a character from a music video. In kind of the absolute best way possible.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that it has very little to do with Resident Evil, and when you're going to see a movie called Resident Evil.
Resident Evil, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and maybe at some point we'll watch some more of the other Paul W.S. Anderson Resident Evils.
I should just say straight up, I don't know if you've seen them. I think you haven't.
Which ones? The Resident Evil movies?
Yeah.
I've seen the first 3 or maybe, and then I've seen, I think, the first 3, and then I think I've seen bits and pieces of the later ones, but I haven't actually watched them.
because I'm gonna say they get both more and less tied to the games, especially less as they go on, to the point where it's bizarre and kind of fascinating, because especially the longer they go on, they will keep introducing characters from the games, but in weird and bizarre contexts, while the actual universe becomes more and more odd. So, like, you know, famously in the Resident Evil series, one of the big things is that the viruses, the zombie outbreaks, do all eventually get contained. The world, because basically a lot of Resident Evil, even though it came out 6 years before, feels very much like a post 9/11 series, right? Where it's basically like the attack on Raccoon City.
It changed the world like forever, but the world is still here, and the world's still progressing in a fashion very similar to our world.
Yeah, exactly. Like, well, in the Anderson movies, and also this is true, I believe, of the S.D. Perry novels, and I believe some of the, like, you know, the comic book series that are in their own separate alternate universe, instead the zombie virus simply takes over the world, and it, you know, drastically alters the series in many ways. For whatever reason, in 3, the zombie virus has caused the world to turn into a desert, which is fascinating, because I kind of feel like most of the population becoming zombies would do a lot well for climate change.
Yeah, they should have just gone straight into the Monster Hunter movie from there.
Yeah, not to suggest that we should create a zombie virus to, you know, stave off the effects of climate change. But then like they'll add like Chris or Claire, but Chris will be like the leader of a gang of survivors on a Californian, like, condemned building, and Wesker will be, you know, this crazy actually, that's basically from the games. But in 5, they introduce Leon, and they introduce Ada, but Leon and Ada's relationships have not been defined before. Those characters have never appeared before, but they're shown on screen, and they end up actually replacing the importance of the original characters who have become main characters in the series, because it's not just Alice who stays. And so it's this weird thing where, like, kind of the movies become like a fight between the original content and the adapted content. And at any point, the movie will kind of vote in favor of one or the other, and kind of in a haphazard way.
And I feel like, and once again, I haven't seen a lot of the later ones, but I feel like they would introduce a character like Chris and Claire, and then they're like, for a movie, and then that's it, you know?
Yes, yeah, that does happen, yeah.
Jill seems to be in a lot of them, though.
Jill's in a couple. I think Claire also shows up a couple times. The final chapter is very odd, because 5 sort of creates a kind of amazingly insane cliffhanger that the movie just kind of completely abandons, that involves basically Wesker brings out Alice to save the country because Wesker has become president.
Oof, it's weird. One thing I will say about those old movies is I feel like they did eventually start doing a lot of adaptations of different villains and monsters, which were pretty cool.
It's a weird... Yeah. I'm a person, unlike a lot of Resident Evil fans, or maybe older Resident Evil fans, I came into the series through 4. You know, like, as I mentioned, my favorite games tend to be the ones that don't have zombies, and culturally I'm not a fan of zombies as a, like, creative trope.
But see, the thing is, I used to really dig zombies before everything happened with zombies. Like, you know, before it became... Yeah. And we got inundated, and there was just so much zombie media. Because I feel like they work very well as a metaphor for a variety of different things. But once everything is a zombie, then it just kind of... It loses its appeal and its scariness.
You don't have the metaphor because, like... The metaphor has become so popular and so different that the zombies cease to really feel like they have a lot of value.
Yeah, there's no nuance to it, you know? Or because I feel like zombies either work, like I said, when you're using them in an allegorical or sense or as a metaphor, or when you're trying to examine kind of that loss of humanity aspect to it. But both of those things kind of just kind of don't work after a while when you see it so much, you know, when you've seen like eight seasons of The Walking Dead and its spin-offs and everything else.
You eventually do realize that, yes, we are The Walking Dead, and
I get it.
And for me, like, a big appeal of 4 and even when I retroactively became more familiar with Resident Evil as a franchise and as a story, was this idea that, like, the zombies aren't just the only scary thing, that Resident Evil is essentially a world that is in which, like, evil and corrupt and bloated institutions, evil pharmaceutical companies, like that are founded by actual eugenicists that kicked African tribes off their land, evil, weird, like, backwoods European cults, like companies that kind of just come in to exploit small towns and small and rural communities, like, you know, aristocracies, like, all of that stuff is basically these exploitative and cruel forces, and the zombies or the monsters or, you know, each different thing is ultimately a manifestation of that exploitation. And so each game is essentially, in its own way, each game is a mystery. You play as a cop or a reporter or a civilian of some kind. You come into this area, and your goal is that some weird shit's gone down, some odd monsters are about, and your goal is to find out where they came from. And then that's the mystery. There's a mystery element to this, and to this whole thing. And I think that's really a cool thing about the series, and something that, you know, it is very smart about Resident Evil that often gets examined, is this idea of, like, that is its own allegory. And it's an allegory that isn't just zombies, and I think when they use the non-zombies, I think it's more interesting.
Yeah, I like that Village basically had, like, clockwork men and werewolves and vampires and weird fishmen. Yeah. It was exactly.
It's gothic horror, but it still exists in that tone, partially because there's the scientific explanations, but partially because of the fact that it still fits that, because, like, who are the villains? The villains are, you know, mostly, like, weird aristocrats who basically, like, own this, who run this town, like, you're in a bad 80s TV, like, you know, Walking the Earth, like, procedural show, and you have to, like, kind of clean that up. Not really save anyone, because everyone's dead really super early, but it's, like, it still fits in that. Sadly, the mystery is completely gone in both of these movies, partially because of the fact that I think those text crawls help, because it's like, obviously, okay, yeah, the evil corporation did it, which isn't really surprising in most stories, but I do wish that both of them had kind of teased out the mystery a little bit more.
One thing I appreciate about this movie compared to the Paul W.S. Anderson movie is in the old 2002 Resident Evil, it's so long before it feels anything like Resident Evil. Like, I mean, there's some real superficial things. I guess you start in a mansion, whatever. But
you actually direct messaged me when you were watching this movie earlier today that I believe you said it takes 40 minutes for a zombie to show up.
Yes, I because when I finally saw a zombie, I pressed pause just to see what the timestamp said. 40 minutes until you see a zombie, and it's not a long movie, guys.
Yeah,
and I thought it was a really odd choice too, that they have, like, one real scene of kind of tension and danger before that, and that's, like, tripping a trap that has, like a laser that kills people. Like, you gotta avoid the laser, which is fine. It's very video gamey. So, but
guess what? No one avoids the laser.
Yeah, but that's the thing. They kill, like, 3 people, I think, there, and I'm all like, don't you want to keep, like, okay, have one person die from the laser, but don't you want zombie fodder for your zombie movie? Don't you want people to be eaten and attacked by zombies that are, like, dispensable people? You know?
Yeah, it's weird. Also, just to get back, I think, because my whole spiel was actually a getting away from the other thing, which is that one of the things I don't like in the Anderson movies is the reliance on zombies, and zombies almost only alone as your primary threat. And one of the things I like in the new one is that, as much as it is still a zombie movie, obviously it manages to still have Lisa Trevor and the Licker and William Burke in his crazy roided up monster
and
form.
Wesker. Wesker was the villain, man. He was just a person, but he was still, And as much as I didn't like how they represented him, like, that part was fine with him, you know, shooting people. Betraying people, being very Wesker about it.
It's a good way because, like, Umbrella can't just be this, like, amorphous, vaguely capitalist force. Like, it has to have people in it that actually represent it and execute its goals, right? And Wesker, is part of that. Birkin is part of that. In the first movie, there really isn't any of that because there's nothing other than the Red Queen, this, like, AI, which is actually fairly unique because Resident Evil has never actually had, like, a main villain who is basically just a computer. Like, it loves flesh and goop.
Yes. I thought the Red Queen was so weird in,
It's an odd choice.
Speaking of Red Kings and Red Queens and things like that, one thing I thought was really neat. Did you ever play Code Veronica? Are you familiar with Code Veronica?
I'm familiar with it because, yes, I wouldn't want you to talk about this because I actually have a follow-up, but please. I also want to hear what you're saying.
I was going to say, I thought it was amazing. So I kind of mentioned before how this movie uses a lot of the iconography of the Resident Evil games. So, there's so many things that are almost directly, like the flyover to the Alkali Mountains to the mansion is almost exactly. I haven't compared them side by side, but I wouldn't be surprised if it is exact.
There is a fixation on these two movies that borders on the fetishistic.
Yeah, seriously, because it goes over, and that's it's from the GameCube remake, and there's so many other kind of little things like that, and one of them is when Claire is in the orphanage and she's looking at the video footage of other experiments and stuff. There's some video footage of the Ashford twins from Code Veronica, and that footage is also in Code Veronica, and it's almost exactly the same. They do a lot of stuff like that. It's really cool.
Well, the Code Veronica thing is also for another reason, which is that it's to seed a sequel, because Johannes Roberts has specifically gone on record, talking about he's a big Resident Evil fan, loves a lot of the different games. He said that that if he gets a chance to make another movie, and if Chris is in that movie, he has specifically said that Chris will punch a boulder. But the two movies that he seems to really want to actually do are adaptations of Code Veronica and Resident Evil 4, and that's, to me, what makes some of the stuff with Leon interesting. Everyone is so goddamn mean to Leon. His being kind of a dumb jerk who doesn't really know much of anything is so aggressive, and when you realize that it's by a guy who then wants to have Leon go on a Spanish vacation and shoot up 1,000 people, it clicks. It clicks that, of course, this guy really, really loves this character, and he's being mean to him for love, and that's kind of awesome.
I feel it makes sense that they would do Code Veronica, because I feel Claire got so much shine in this. She was, they really portrayed her as this total badass. And they actually, in her relationship with Chris too. So I feel that would make sense for a follow-up movie. Although I feel they would throw Jill in there somewhere. Or maybe they would try to...
I would like to. I feel Resident Evil 3, the Resident Evil 3 story, is kind of a downgrade from 2 in a lot of ways. And it's kind of sad because it's really Jill's only real time to shine solo in the main series, because she was kind of not really used after a while when Shinji Mikami kind of stopped focusing on the older characters, and then when he left, because she came back in 5 as she was brainwashed as a villain and you have to rescue her, and then she was...
Which they did in those old Paul W.S. Anderson movies, and it was weird.
They do, and it's insane.
Yeah.
Because
it's so weird that out of everything to take from the games, they're no, that look for Jill, 100%.
We'll get into this more when we do Resident Evil Afterlife, but basically Afterlife was being made when Resident Evil 5 was being made, and so I don't know who asked who, but someone asked for those characters to be put into the movie, so that's why 4 gets to Afterlife actually gets to have the Executioner Mangini and the Big Man mini boss characters, and it gets to have Jill.
That's so funny.
And it recreates Wesker dramatically weaponizing his sunglasses. It's very, but that's again a thing where it's it's so different, and it's just completely going away. but it still likes Resident Evil enough that it wants to be really include those references. This movie's kind of like that too, but it's so scared of going away, which I both which I understand, and I ultimately don't think this movie needed to. It's like, if you just take them as movies, the Welcome to Raccoon City it's kind of hard to really compare them. I mean, in terms of writing, characters, storytelling, it's vastly superior in most ways. In fact, to the point where, like, Resident Evil Welcome to Raccoon City is so much better than Resident Evil 2002 that it doesn't include, that it's the one that doesn't have a collaboration with Marilyn Manson.
I mean, it's... Yeah. Like, I think I said this when the movie originally came out, but Welcome to Raccoon City has not only an homage, but, like, straight up somebody says itchy tasty.
Yes.
And, like, that's all I really wanted out of this movie, so I can't complain. I won't go so far as to say that it's a good movie.
I will say it's a good movie that really could have gone a little bit lighter on the references. I mean, and, like, Jill is a very good character, I think, for the most part, but it's kind of frustrating when feels like she's the one who gets all of the most, like, heavy-handed video game references, because there's, like, the point when she and the other people are, like, chatting, and she's like, how would you rather die?
That was
swallowed by a giant snake or torn apart by a giant shark? Because, guess what? In Resident Evil 1, 3 of the optional bosses or not optional, but 3 of the regular bosses are a snake and a shark, and there's also a plant, and I would have loved Plant 42 to be in this somewhere.
That's nice. I'm glad you said that, Jill, but I would rather have seen those things. Like, that's actually probably one of my you know what, in both of these movies, there's, like, they don't do much with the mansion. This one, actually, the mansion at least is a location. That's where Wesker does his thing.
There's a puzzle.
Yeah, there is a puzzle, a music puzzle.
You have to... Yeah, I mean... Yeah, like, this is, but it's not a lot.
It does the helicopter thing from part 2, but it takes it from the police station and puts it in the mansion. That's kind of neat.
Yeah.
But I felt like there could have been more in the mansion. I don't know, like, they just do, like, an in the dark scene where you shoot it out, but, like, it didn't, I don't know, like I wanted more exploring a spooky mansion, you know?
I agree, and I think it's kind of the same thing, is that this is a very... and I think probably ultimately my biggest criticism of this movie is that it's very lopsided, where, like, the most attention and the most care is given to Claire and Leon, who are, like, the most interesting characters or the most charismatic characters, and because of it, their attempt to defend and then abandon the police station is the most interesting, and while Chris and Jill's exploration of the mansion is kind of, like, they share roughly, I think, the same amount of screen... No, I think that they get a little less screen time, but also there's less in it, and I think that is a genuine problem.
Yeah, they would have been better off having this be just a Resident Evil 1 movie, and then you could even seed things, like, you could still have that diner scene with Leon, you know, as a rookie, but then don't really include him here, then the next movie's about him and Claire, and, you know, just have Claire show up at the beginning to talk to Chris, but then, like, whatever, that's another movie.
Yeah, or you do basically, like, you do it like an 8-episode miniseries or whatever, and it's like, maybe you start by focusing more on the mansion, and then over time as the zombie action, like the actual zombie
this would have been much better as a miniseries. You could have even incorporated elements from Resident Evil 3 into it if you did it that way.
I mean, yeah, ultimately I'm kind of glad that we got Birkin instead of Nemesis. I'm not the biggest Nemesis fan.
I feel like Nemesis is a little overdone. I mean, I'd like to see Nemesis at some point, but yeah, I'm really glad we got Birkin. Birkin is a perfect villain for a first Resident Evil movie, to be honest.
Yeah, he is an evil scientist who works for an evil corporation. He's who also is an abusive husband and father. He's like the perfect symbol of everything that Resident Evil is scared of and doesn't like.
Yep, I agree.
So... Yeah, it's interesting because we're focusing we're talking so much more about Welcome to Raccoon City, and I realize that this is a review of both movies, but the truth is that really, it's hard to talk about one. Like, it's genuinely hard to talk about it because there's just so little to it. It is a very pretty movie. Anderson
the action beats are good. They're not great. Like I said, they're very reminiscent of trying to emulate that feel from The Matrix.
And Aliens.
And but it's not. But it's still entertaining to watch.
Yeah. It has good. There are definitely good shots. If you like, in more dramatic shots, I think, like, for instance, the stuff of like Alice waking up is probably like feels more iconic than a lot of the shots in Welcome to Raccoon City. But again, the difference is that, like, this move is that, like, Welcome to Raccoon City is being made as a piece of fan service that's also a movie, and like Resident Evil 2002 is shot as a music video.
Yeah, and like I said, there's a semblance of plot because the character of Alice has no memory. She meets up with I guess like a group from Umbrella that's trying to
invest. They're trying to clean up the zombies.
Yeah, they're trying to investigate what happened in the facility, because I guess the entrance to this facility, that they call the Hive, is through this mansion where Alice and her husband live, but they're not really husband and wife. They're just kind of guards that are living double lives. They're like spies, more or less. They're undercover, I guess is the word I'm looking for.
So that's a mystery.
Yeah.
But it's a mystery that's solved in the first shots, in the first scenes of the movie.
Right, but there is a mystery of what her actual relationship is to her husband, and that character ends up being the villain. So I think that's pretty well done. I feel like that's more of a mystery than anything in these movies. But then again, we know Resident Evil, so we knew Wesker would betray them. But I guess if you don't know Resident Evil, you wouldn't think that. But then at the same time, if you don't know Resident Evil, the betrayal of Wesker comes out of nowhere. There is a shot where he looks at his pager and they say, like, leave the city now. Oh yeah, they talk about his girlfriend or something. Like, Chief Ironside makes some cracks.
Ooh, you said Ironside. I would kind of love to see a movie where Ironside from Ironside investigates.
Wow, well,
Well, that will be for your crossover fan fiction, viewers. Yeah. But, what's interesting is that,
I think I've probably called him Ironside like 3 times, by the way. It's just Irons, yeah? It's the same as...
it's Chief Irons.
Chief Irons, that's right. They did a good job with him, but I feel like he's always older, though, in the games.
I mean, it's hard... I mean, Donald Logue is a pretty old guy.
Yeah, and I feel like he definitely fit the character, for especially that version of the character they were going for.
Yeah. I mean, he definitely feels older, but also partially because the cast feels younger because they're trying to get at, like, how the Resident Evil characters are always super young, where, like, Chris is like a macho cop who basically used to be an Air Force captain, even though he's like 20 in the first games.
Yeah, the Resident Evil games aren't the most realistic on any account.
Perhaps the least when it comes to the representation of age when it comes to law enforcement and professional business. Because lest we forget, Wesker was in his 20s a super scientist who was also a corrupt police captain who was also like an agent for a pharmaceutical giant who was inventing a zombie virus. Yeah, one thing that's sort of interesting, and we're not going to do these now, I would like us to do them at some point, is that while the Anderson movies were going on, and while Resident Evil was transitioning into the 7th generation with games like Resident Evil 5 and Resident Evil 6, they started making their own CG movies, which were not intended to compete with Anderson's at all. They were meant as, in fact, most of those movies are in canon with the story. They're set within the continuity of the games. And they star a lot of these characters that we've seen, Leon and Claire and Jill. And it's kind of interesting because many of them try to be very serious. We are following the story of the games. We are set in this world. If you watch this movie, the world of the games will be fleshed out. But they actually really follow the template of Anderson's movies a lot more. they only use zombies and have only one token non-zombie monster as the final boss. And I say this because these are movies where the final antagonist is the final boss, 100%.
Yep, that's definitely how it's structured. Like, they're very video gamey.
Yeah. And I think that's it's kind of interesting because they try to be more... They do actually all try to be mysteries. They try to have misdirection. They all do have the, like, era-appropriate stuff. But they're definitely taking cues from the movies in the way that I think the movies kind of take cues from the games. I don't know if this movie will have that, partially because it was obviously not as successful, which is not fair because if you are releasing a movie into a theater during the COVID-19 pandemic, you're not going to do great unless you're Spider-Man.
That's one of his superpowers, is to break $1 billion in a pandemic. Yeah. He was bitten by a radioactive person who ignores whatever. I'm frustrated with the return to theaters, but that's maybe me. Having said that, the film still didn't do very well. Its critical reception was mediocre. I do really hope that they get a chance to do a sequel. I think that I feel like it would be absurd to having gotten this cast, which, Wesker is not necessarily great as Wesker. Tom Hopper is not necessarily, like, the best, but, a lot of these actors, can figure it out.
Well, yeah, especially, Evan Jogia is Leon, and Kaylee, so I'm gonna screw up her name, so I apologize. Kaya Scolodario as Claire. They're really good. Like, I want to see this Leon go fight giants and salamander fish monsters. I want to see this Claire go through crazy Antarctica puzzles.
Yeah, I definitely wouldn't mind it. And the thing is, they're definitely not going to rest with this IP. So I feel like if they don't do this, it's just going to be like a 4 or 5 year hiatus and then a reboot again.
Yeah. Just for, according to Wikipedia, the box office was about 31 million, or a little under 32 million on a budget of 25. Ooh, that's not good.
That is not good. And that is including international. Not that I think this has that big of an international reach, but...
I actually don't agree. I can't tell. But I do think it's worth pointing out that Anderson's movies were very big overseas. They weren't just American successes or Japanese successes. His movies were huge. Huh. Like, that's part of the reason why they made so much, almost all of them made over 100 million, because they had a very wide audience. And so I think that, like, if nothing else, the Resident Evil IP should help it in the long... Maybe it'll have, like, it'll have a long run, but, it's not...
I think what hurts it... I think one of the things that hurts it is that it didn't resonate with a large portion of the fan base, and I feel like those are the people that you need to, like, keep it alive in a cult status,
Yeah, not in a cult status, not a make $100 million status.
Yeah, and it's definitely not $100 million status, so...
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So apparently, it's considered it's a success. It's just not an amazing one. And it's hard because, like, every industry is kind of desperately wanting really big successes, while it's also a climate where you can't.
Yeah.
And in the case of movies being put in theaters, there is an argument that perhaps it shouldn't. Like.
Yeah. Right now it's especially difficult if you're not IP driven, which is why I think they pushed out a Resident Evil movie because of just the climate,
Oh yeah. This movie was being worked on before for like 5 years too.
Okay. I don't know if I really have much more to say about this movie or the other or any movie called Resident Evil.
I'm just gonna say a couple things. I overall liked this movie, and when I say this, I mean Welcome to Raccoon City. I like the actors, I like the diverse casting, I think the writing has issues, but the plotting is actually surprisingly deft and almost kind of gets ahead of itself in a way.
Yeah, like I said, they made some smart choices, and there's a lot of economy in the storytelling as well, which I appreciate for sure.
It's also just interesting. Like, this is, I think, the first time we've ever done a movie where, like, I can comfortably say, the plotting of this movie is interesting. Not just the adaptation is interesting, or this is based on a property I like, or even this is a film I enjoyed. This actually does make interesting decisions. I don't think it does them all well, but it's genuinely nice to have that in a podcast where, like, by design, the things we're going to be focusing on are adaptations, and since this is movies into video games into movies, those adaptations are, you know, they're going to be big action movies that often follow very, stock plot structures. It's nice to genuinely be surprised.
Yeah, I don't know if there's anything that was too surprising here, but once again, that comes from the stance of knowing Resident Evil, you know?
Yeah. Also, just saying, once again, this film did not feature a soundtrack by Marilyn Manson, so again, another point in its favor, which is both one of the most regrettable and one of the most bizarre, things I learned about the first movie. Yeah, I enjoyed it. You enjoyed it. I think we're going to disagree on how we feel about it as a work of cinema, but...
yeah, I don't hate it.
Yeah, no, I know. Yeah. This isn't calling you out. To be
no, I understand. I mean, I think there's some people on staff actually at Source Gaming that I've spoken to that really dislike this movie. I don't. I thought it was a fun ride. I thought as a fan of the game, there was a lot of fan service, but mostly I feel like some of the visual callbacks were really neat. And I enjoyed the characters. I thought it's not. Like I said, it's not a good movie, but it's not a bad movie. It's definitely entertaining. I would recommend it. But as long as people kind of know what they're getting into, it's not not a fantastic movie by any stretch.
Yeah, if you're listening to this podcast and have no familiarity with Resident Evil, which I'm going to just go ahead and guess is probably a small number, possibly just my mother if she has decided to listen to this beyond 10 minutes. Hi, Mom. But if you don't know Resident Evil, I do think this movie can be a little hard to get into. It's so stacked with lines that probably would make no damn sense unless you knew where they're coming from. Why would you talk about, Jill talking about, the snake or the shark line, just makes her sound like such a weird person. It honestly makes her feel actually kind of like a 90s alternative character. Like Lydia from Beetlejuice. That's where my mind went to.
I love Lydia.
Lydia's
Can we
great.
talk about Beetlejuice one day? Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Having said, I will talk about Beetlejuice the movie, and I will talk about Beetlejuice the musical, but I will not talk about Beetlejuice the TV show.
The cartoon?
Except... Yeah, you know about that?
Dude, you forget my age. I used to watch that show as it was airing all the time.
Can we just talk about the fact that it's really weird that it's about Lydia's friendship with Beetlejuice, a guy who at the end of the movie tried to make her his child bride?
Yes, but this comes from a time where movies that were not appropriate for children, they wanted to adapt and sell toys of. So it was very loosely connected. But I have a lot of fond memories of that show, but it's just nostalgia of being a child when that show was on.
I also will say, I think the musical is actually my favorite Beetlejuice adaptation.
I've never seen the musical, but I've heard good things, and I would really like to watch the musical.
Yeah, it's very good. But anyway, we will probably not talk about Beetlejuice, but if you'd like, tell in the comments and we'll try to work Beetlejuice into our next movie, which I'm hoping will be Hitman. Why do I want to watch Hitman again? I don't, but I want to talk about it on a podcast, and I'll need to watch it again to remember.
Yeah, we've planned out a few of these, so hopefully we can knock them out a little bit quicker because we have an idea of where to go for the next couple ones. And then after, even beyond those, are stuff to do. We were very close to doing Monster Hunter, but this was close enough.
I'm actually glad we went with this one, both because we already did basically two Paul W.S. Anderson movies in a row tonight, but we also did something else, and, I'm sure we'll eventually do Monster Hunter.
It's on the list. It's on the list.
So, any final thoughts for both of these movies, specifically?
Not much. The 2002 movie is just, it's very much, like I said, I think if you ignore the movies that come after it, and I know some people love it, including you, the ones that, but if you just take it as its own thing, I think it's very interesting to just view it as a side story to the games.
Yeah, and also just, not necessarily intentionally so, because this was worked on by Anderson and by a, German film production company and not by Capcom, but, almost feels like kind of IP, trying to, expand the IP in a way. Yeah,
that's how it feels, even though that's not what it is. And it's like a fun action movie. The zombies come in way too late. It doesn't, and it, like I said, doesn't feel very Resident Evil until quite a way in. But yeah. I think it's still worth watching. It's a fun action movie. The new one... Oh, well, sorry, go ahead.
No, you please go.
And I was going to say, the new one is super fan-servicey.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of it works. Probably more works than should when you really look at it. Not a fan of yes, not a fan of some of the casting and some of the acting. But I kind of liked it. It was it's fun. It was a fun experience, and like I said, especially if you are a specific type of fan of Resident Evil. You really like Resident Evil, but you're also not going to be one of those nitpicky people that gets upset at changes to plot and characters and things like that. Because there's a lot of references, but it's still nowhere near a quote unquote perfectly done adaptation. So you got to get that out of your head too before you watch it.
Yeah, if you are, deeply, deeply dependent on, on making sure that you have the, crazy angel puzzle in the police station, or, the angel statue, or if you are one of those people who just really feels like Leon has to be blonde, I'm sorry, pal, I got nothing for you. But if you're someone who just would like there to have been more... of an actual relationship between some of these characters, or would have liked the plot to, actually kind of congeal and connect a little bit better than it did. My sorry pal, I got nothing for you is still the same, but done with a greater degree of sympathy. Yeah, so I liked it. It has some issues. I would like to see this continued. I would really like to see this continued. I really, like I said, I really want to see...
Okay, everybody out there, to make Wolfman happy, I need you all to go and purchase this on video on demand to rent it, so that this can be a success, so that we can, even if you don't like the movie, that way, hopefully you like this podcast and it'll let us do another version.
Look, I love Resident Evil 4. I think this Leon and this director, I think this is pretty perfect for Resident Evil 4. I want to see it all. The the fall down the pit, the spike traps, all of it. But so my feelings on Resident Evil Welcome to Raccoon City, I think, are pretty well established by this point. So I guess I'll end by talking about 2002's film. And it's a weird one. I was very negative when I'm talking about this, almost universally negative, and I do want to make it clear that I didn't dislike this film. I actually did enjoy watching it. I just think it's such an odd creature. Not just even as an adaptation, although it's an incredibly odd adaptation, even by, weird Dino Hatton / M. Bison's, Bisonopolis standards.
Oh, man.
It's an odd movie, and it really does feel like a movie just completely from another time. I mean, Welcome to Raccoon City also does feel like very much a movie made in 2021, and not just because of the fact that it's a movie about an evil virus. But it's so, just the actual storytelling, the character stuff, it's so odd, and it genuinely doesn't feel like anything that could ever get made again, for better and for worse.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating that 2002 movie started off as like a Resident Evil adjacent project. Like, you know, like it's not Resident Evil, but inspired by. And that just like makes so much sense to me.
Yeah, like it's literally how would W.S. Anderson approach Resident Evil? Well, he'd, you know, turn it into aliens. He'd excise really most of the mystery. He'd focus on, he'd focus on, you know, like all the weird, cool shots, right? Like it would be all this hyper-focused, like super commercial, super music video focus, and that's kind of cool. And I feel as dismissive as I am about it, and as ultimately as much as I feel like it's not really a good system for telling, you know, like good art and good storytelling.
It sure is slick, though.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was never a fan of the Paul W.S. Anderson movies. I think overall on the series as a whole, you're more into them than I would ever be.
Yeah,
but like I feel like it's fine. You know what it reminds me of? What are those movies? Vampires and werewolves and black leather.
You're Underworld.
Underworld. Yeah, that's what it reminds me of.
You know, I actually have seen a couple Underworld movies. I've not been impressed by them, but they are probably movies I should actually watch and complete the whole series, right? I mean, I did so for Resident Evil. I can do so for Rise of the Lycans.
I mean, Kate Beckinsale's delightful. What do you want?
I mean, yeah.
But like it seems very much cut from that same mold, I guess. Like, yeah.
It's what if the Matrix, but we got rid of all of the stuff that made it the Matrix.
Yeah, all of the nuance and philosophy.
Yeah, what if, and also in like the Keanu of it all.
Yeah, exactly. Like, and then we have a Trinity lead. But that's kind of underselling, you know,
those movies.
Yeah, and the character of Trinity, to be honest with you.
Yeah, and Carrie-Anne.
And Carrie-Anne Moss, yeah. But you get what I'm saying. You understand.
Of course.
Yeah.
Basically, these films, for all the fact that they are ostensibly adaptations of the same video game, they could not be more different. And even despite the fact, it should also note, Welcome to Raccoon City is partially produced by Paul W.S. Anderson, which I'm assuming is just due to the fact that like he exec produced everything.
Yeah, but like sometimes, you know, executive producer doesn't necessarily mean much on some projects.
Yeah, I doubt he was that creatively involved. I'm sure he was just like, you know what, I'll help support. I'll just, you know, I'll give my name to it, and while I work on this dumb Monster Hunter movie that I am sure is dumb, and I'm sure we'll watch it and talk about it, about how it's dumb, and maybe we'll like some stuff, and hopefully we'll like more than we don't.
Yeah, that's what we look for in video game adaptations. Do I like more than I hate? Because that's where we're at.
You know what? You know what? Look, I am in my third week of this Kingdom Hearts project.
Oof. Yeah, I am aware of that.
Just so we're clear, yeah, this is January 18th, so a day with some not great video game news for the video game industry, and also the time that I played through Atlantica.
We're going to talk about some stuff on this Good Morning Source Gaming, but this is going to come out so much later.
Yeah, so basically just, you know, I will not likely be on that, as I don't think I've ever been on a single one, but just imagine me screaming a lot. Anyway,
we should wrap this up. I don't think we have much more to say.
I think at this point it's probably the best too. So, you know, if you like this, please check out some more of our videos. And you know what? There's a Patreon bar, technically a Patreon link that if you click it will become a Patreon bar in your list of bar internet tabs. And I would totally recommend you throw a little bit of change our way. And also, if you have an idea of a film you'd like us to watch because you think it's good, or because you think it would be an interesting discussion, or perhaps because you just want us to feel pain, tell us about that in the comments.
I will promise this. If you put something in the comments of this video, which means you've listened to this point, and it's a video game, an actual video game media project, and not like some weird porn spin-off or something like that. It actually has to do with video games. We will get to it if you comment on this video. Yeah. I will promise you that.
Do this, because otherwise we may do the Hitman movie next, and the Hitman movie's really bad. It will probably be even worse than the Double Dragon movie for Spazzy, because I think it's worse than the Double Dragon movie.
Oof, yeah. Although if you do say it'll do like a series and it's very long, we may only do a couple episodes. So I'm gonna just throw that out.
We're figuring out how we do this, because obviously, like, we're not the Hard Times. We're not going to do a podcast for every single episode of the Super Mario Brothers Super Show.
I would love to, though.
I mean, if we were doing this like once a week,
then we could maybe swing something like that.
I would, and also I would totally advocate doing this once a week, but
yeah, it's difficult. We have things. We have lives sometimes, maybe a little bit.
Yeah. So with that, I believe we'll end it. With as much as this has been like, you know, a pretty solid appreciation of one movie over another movie, I do hope that we kind of end this with, you take from this understanding that, like, as much as we did prefer one of these movies to the other one, we did find both of them very interesting, and we found both of them worthy of discussion.
Yeah, I think both of these movies I think are worth watching, but I could see people watching both of them and disliking both. But they might also just be, you know, your cup of tea. You never know.
Yeah, I would also say that that I am a big fan of Resident Evil Retribution, and I don't necessarily think the movie fully gets at why that movie is fun, but anyway, such as it is.
Yep.
Thanks for watching, everyone.
Yep,
especially this far in.
Bye, guys. You know, all that return to the source stuff and all that.
Yeah. Take care.